could be at war. They're sending in the troops who even had a score. Why they get employed unless we never adore it? And violence is violence, no matter who inflicts. Whether you're in a straight fight or a war cause of politics. Unless we never adore it, and violence is violence, no matter who inflicts. Whether you're in a straight fight or a war cause of politics.
All right, that was Violence is Violence, The Horrors in the Museum, The Cloud Song, Flesh Crucifix, Cosmic Curse, Farce, and then we started off with Teenage Time Killer. Great title there. So, you know, I know this is a band we're not going to focus too much on, but I think it's kind of a cool band, the UK Anthrax, because to me, like, they sort of sound like, you know, Violence is Violence is a song we heard from. Great title, Capitalism is Cannibalism, which is a very anarcho kind of title, but they sort of sound like a mixture of like Crass and Conflict in terms of like what those two bands kind of brought to the table. You know, in terms of like the ranting sort of nature of Crass, but like more the like violence of sort of Conflict a little bit. At least that's what I kind of picked up from them. So tell us a little bit about the non-American Anthrax, I guess.
So I think they were, I think they're from Gravesend, which is in the southeast, you know, east, just outside the east end of London. And then Gary, or Oscar as he's known, is still, I mean, Anthrax is still going today, and Gary runs his own DIY record label called Grow Your Own. And he puts out, you know, fantastic modern anarcho-punk, and they're all sort of benefit releases, you know, so he's, you know, he's a lifer, definitely. But that, you know, I love that EP. I mean, it's a typical Crass EP, you know, the way it was laid out, the way it was produced, and everything like that. And I think it was like what we were talking about earlier, where, you know, the second wave is influenced by the first wave, and the influences get distilled and distilled until you get to like the pure essence of like anarcho-punk, you know, and that's kind of, you know, you're getting kind of near that with that Anthrax EP, and it was just so noisy and so angry and so well intentioned as well. Great band.
Yeah, and they came out, their first song was on, speaking of the Bullshit Detector comps that we talked about, they were on Bullshit Detector 2, and then I think that record we just heard came out on Crass Records, so they're kind of, you know, under that, all these labels, you know, Mortar Hate and Spider Leg, you know, it's all like those initial early kind of foundational bands like set up like the pathway for all the other bands to sort of like find an avenue to create music and stuff like that, which is cool, you know. So.
Yeah, I think that was I think that was a really important part of it, really. Crass probably, you know, as it went on, probably thought, you know, they eventually realized they created a monster sort of thing. You know, I doubt they ever wanted like 1,000 bands that sounded like Crass, you know. So it's the same way that Discharge probably never imagined there'd be 1,000.
All the D-beat bands, yeah.
Sound like Discharge, but
So in this next set, we're going to mainly be kind of, you know, hitting on one of the big players. I would say, along with probably Subhumans and Crass, I think Conflict is probably the other, you know, of the big three of this kind of scene. But before we get into Conflict stuff, because I'm sure that will eat up a lot of this talk set, Omega Tribe, I kind of threw them in here as like a palate cleanse maybe. They seem like kind of one of the more, kind of almost an outlier of the scene in terms of like tunefulness. They really seem like they're a little bit more musical than some of these other bands in terms of their diversity of what they're kind of bringing to the table. And what a great song, Freedom, Peace, and Unity. I mean, tell us a little bit about, you know, Omega Tribe before we kind of dive into Conflict here.
Yeah, I guess they were one of those, you know, there were many bands that made it the sort of, you know, the big tapestry of the scene, as it were. And I think we touched on it earlier when we said, that there was a lot of bands that, didn't sound like you would maybe expect them to sound. I think when I was picking an Amiga Tribe song, I naturally veered towards the heavier end of some of their stuff. But I mean, some of the stuff they've done is really, really sort of lightweight, very melodic. And the lyrics are all the more poignant and powerful because of it,
Mm-hmm.
And I always he was a great bassist as well, and as a bassist,
I was gonna say Daryl's bass playing on here is great, and I thought as a bass player you would kind of pick up on that.
You get hooked in by it, sort of thing, and but their album, I think it's called No Love Lost. I remember it's not quite what it used to be, but it's such a great record, and I think it's an unsung sort of classic, really, of the Anarcho scene. Yeah,
and it charted really well too. And then I think they toured with Conflict, actually. So
and I think another interesting thing, if I remember rightly, is I think Vice Versa from Poison Girls was one of their mothers.
Oh wow!
So I think it's Vi's son is in the band. I'm sure. In fact, definitely, it's Pete Fender from Amiga Tribe. It's Vi's son.
Yeah, and he kind of came in as like a fourth member a little bit later after I think they started. So yeah, that makes sense that he's a little bit younger. So
but yeah, no, like you said, worlds apart from Conflict sonically.
Yeah, and speaking of Conflict, would you put them as like the next tier right after Crass in terms of importance to the longevity of the scene or the historical importance of the scene? Because that's where we're kind of going next.
I mean, I think, if you're talking about, the top five of anarcho punk, it's got to be sort of Crass, Flux, Conflict, Subhumans, and P9.
Gotcha.
But a lot of people would say sort of Crass, Flux, and Conflict, would be the most, the seminal anarcho punk bands. I mean, Conflict took, they boiled it all down, and they were much more confrontational. They were really black and white in their sort of lyrics. They wanted to provoke a reaction. And they did, but Meat Means Murder. I think I was already a vegetarian by that at that point when I heard Meat Means Murder, but it sort of encapsulated the sort of outrage that made me stop eating meat, and it was so angry. The Conflict music was so angry. When I used to go hunt sabbing in the 80s. I used to listen to the song Berkshire Cunt from Nation of Animal Lovers EP. Mm-hmm. We used to listen to that to get fired up before the hunt sab. It was really inspirational, sort of.
I think that's what drew me to them as well, as just the confrontational energy and just how
and they did that album. I love the first album, It's Time to See Who's Who, but it's very punk record, and that next record, Increase the Pressure, I think is where they came into their own. One side of it's live and isn't particularly good, but the studio side of that album.
I mean, the title track, the end of that, Fuck 'Em Up Again. I mean, it's like it's a call to arms almost, for like the people that were still in the scene by 84 almost, Yeah,
it was, they were a very, very important band. No matter what, you think about what they became or what's happened in recent years with them. The new album they've been talking about for years and years and years just hasn't materialized, and Colin, the singer, seems to just upset everybody on sort of social media now, which is what he does best at the end of the day.
He's an antagonist, you know what I mean? I mean, look at the name of the band, Conflict. That's what he's looking for,
Yeah. So so a lot of people have sort of fallen out of love with the band, but I mean, you can't deny the power of that of the stuff they were doing.
Hey, and they even gave us kind of by accident. Well, I don't know if they gave it to us, but Colin, I believe, was friends with Ian Astbury, right? And Ian Astbury kind of hung out around Conflict in the early years before he went on to Southern Death Cult.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't know that name.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting. Yeah, in the early days, I read that Ian Astbury was kind of like good friends with those guys, which is so strange. But and I'm a huge Cult fan, so why not?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. Like, this seems like a band that if someone was like a metal person and wanted to know, or you wanted to kind of lure them in a little bit, and maybe you didn't want to go like full Amebix, maybe they were just they were a tamer metal person. I might give them Conflict, because even songs like Blind Attack have like a thrashy undertone. By the time you get to From Protest to Resistance and some of the stuff on Ungovernable Force, I mean, that stuff is heavy.
Yeah, that's the stuff that a friend of mine who's deeply it was in the hardcore genre, was like, okay, you need to check this out. You like Discharge, this is the next way to go.
Yeah, would you agree with that? Do you think they're a good gateway band to get people kind of, to bridge that sort of punk to metal sort of thing?
I mean, Amebix were very metal. I mean, Anti-Sect were very metal.
Sure. And of course, we're building to them towards the end.
Yeah. Conflict, I remember hearing the song Cruise and being, kind of blown away by how angry it was. I mean, everything they did was angry. But, that first EP, I can't remember the name of it now. The
House That Man Built? Yeah, Blind Attack.
I mean, there's a song on there about, a feminist song with a female singer.
Well, even Blind Attack, that we're going to play has female vocals on it, which I thought was really cool,
And then when you factor in as well, they did More to Hate. They did all these compilations, that gave upcoming anarcho bands a sort of outlet, in the same way that Crass did with the Bullshit Detector records.
Yeah, and then something that was kind of interesting too is that they chart it really well. We haven't really talked about that too much, but one of the things I kind of was constantly really impressed with and reading your book was how well some of these so visceral, very political, very angry bands that we've talked about thus far, like, did on the charts in the UK. I mean, that's pretty. I don't know. Was that like an anomaly of this era, or is that something you would have expected?
It was the independent charts, which were a big deal in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Flux of Pink Indians, that new Smile EP, if I remember rightly, was at number 1 or number 2 for months and months and months. I mean, these bands were selling huge amounts of records, hundreds of thousands of copies of these EPs and stuff. Which is pretty impressive when you look back at it now and compare it to sort of physical sales these days.
Sure, yeah. But that was just something that kind of blew my mind is how well these bands were doing, so.
And they did chart in the sort of lower ends of the national charts as well, which always blew my mind.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing about Conflict for me was when Big John, the original bassist, left, Oddie from Broken Bones joined. It
was right around Ungovernable Force, I think, is when he joined.
Yeah. Yep. So I think that sort of cemented, so you had the two camps coming together again. It was like the end of the sort of, rivalry, because I guess Broken Bones would have been like a Studs and Leather band,
chaos punk. Yep, exactly.
But I think it just showed that whole division was kind of silly, really, because Oddie was in Broken Bones, but he was a vegetarian and he was super intense and very political, and he was a perfect fit for Conflict.
Absolutely.
It just shows that the two camps were a lot closer than they realized, I think.
Sure. All right, well, let's get into it. We've got Omega Tribe with Freedom, Peace, and Unity. Then we've got Blind Attack from Conflict's The House That Man Built. Then from their debut record, It's Time to See Who's Who, we're going to hear the aforementioned Meat Means Murder. then a pair from Increase the Pressure, the title track, and from Protest to Resistance. And then we're going to end with a tune from The Battle Continues called Mighty and Superior.
Past history tells all government is right.
I'm walking through the grey walkways of the city, and through the brightly lit shops and supermarkets, and I'm walking through the fields of the innocent, passing by the fairy tale farm, balancing on the brittle edge of a short life that is ended by the knife.
The factory is still churning out all processed baked and neat and obscure butchered substance, and the label reads meat. In a beer on false names such as pork and veal and beef, and eyes and eye, and life's a life that our fucked up belief. Yet every day production lines are pushing out this farce, just to end up on your tables and shout out of your ass.
gazing at the baneful products. And from behind the bright colours and false smiles, I can smell the lingering death and see the decaying skins. Forth from the green grass, the pungent smell of decomposing meat that penetrates the walls of the kitchen. And from the red lorries on the black, in unison with the red lights and the red juice, the Sunday kitchen spills out the stench of the abattoir.
Serves the sun! Staircase in the toilet spots, the cops are crowded, so just for the concept, this blood and frost things up, nothing else, nothing else, you're my name, serves the sun! Serves the sun! Serves the fucking sun!
The Sunday kitchen spills out the stench of the abattoir, the butcher's blade glistening in the eye of the master. The deadened life of a baby sits upon the plate, the spilt guts falling from the chute to the basting tin, the carcass from the car crash in the age of the train.
Never mind the bullshit, it's the facts! Second out for the same old songs, right back against the system that's all and wrong. Get another better round against the wall of power. Blasphemous attacks blow the leaders cover. It's a message from those who won't take no more. I'm seeing a privileged profit on the bar. Of the scientists, piss they call research. It's all we're scum and good feedback. Well, bodies to the wall, keep smashing on the wall. Bone pressure on, and government will fall. It takes more than rules and more than words to reclaim nation is controlled by heart. And police, army and fun as whales. And ever waiting for the ballast from the people who care. To question and control the dividing line. Power must be tested in testing time. Power must be tested, we heard that time and time again. But no matter how much pain and protest, nothing seems to change. The government shows forces and our movement cows in fear. Substance right for freedom, while others simply sneer. Side roll wrecking with a side rail song. Well, it's the same fucking system and it still stands strong. The rail continues so biased to them. We mark our advocate and veterans again. Try working for something that the system can't make. Creating something that the law can't take back. As a loss of privilege, living our life. Power ain't been to stone as a time to fuck 'em up again, fuck 'em up again, fuck 'em up again.
Sibling forcing back no Russians when peace was all built for trust. Screwing with the Yankees, law and order is our mark. Sick of time, collaboration, stored in the context, organized, well run, waiting for a simple destruction. Afraid their choice to rise in the mushroom. Come to the mushroom, the total combustion, the realization of annihilation, Poseidon's answer to try to blood you. Your choice that must die, but you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. Invincible as they boil the seas for power, accruing armies on the land to protect the state that cowers from the Ruskies, from the dollar. One's investment, one's their enemy. These people, why can't they love? Human feelings don't matter. What's wrong when they would rule, building castles and tycoons, and trust out to the furrow, sending rockets to the moon, making missiles take the palm, nuclear power for our own, raising hell up from the mine to the last human sacrifice. Well, if you think all's well and strong, there's a movement that's uprising. If you think we can take that, you've got one hell of a shot coming. You might just have pushed too far, you're superior to nothing. The ungovernable force is gonna drag you out of hiding. You think you've got us beaten, you make one slip and you'll know it. We're watching every move you make as you're us, forget it. For once we take an inch, you just watch us take the mile. Your servants turn their backs and your inner world starts to my superior, you are the rulers, we're the rules. You said the grass is green on the other side. We couldn't see, of course. You represent your people, it's your own gun you put first. You burn up for all countries, your investment to preserve. Force invader Russians when peace was all built for love.
All right, you just heard Mighty and Superior. From protest to resistance, increase the pressure, meat means murder, and blind attack from conflict. Then we started that whole set off with a much more calm and peaceful tune called Freedom, Peace, and Unity. So, but yeah, we're right in it now, Ian. We're kind of in the crux of like the heaviness is starting to increase of the show. So for the people that have stuck with us who were maybe naysayers of the scene, they're about to be, I think, rewarded, right? Wouldn't you say? You know, this is kind of where
validated, maybe?
Yeah, where it all starts to come together a little bit. And the last song that we're going to actually end with in the next set from Conflict is Metal Mania. And we were kind of just talking off mic about, you know, a band like Conflict using, you know, metal. What was kind of the execution of that? Why were they commenting on here?
I think there was a general frustration with the metal scene. I guess they were playing into stereotypes, you know, subconsciously as well. But you know, that most metal bands sang about Satan, you know, Dungeons and Dragons or what
fantasy stuff. Yeah, a lot of that.
Yeah, and you know, and I think that for a while that was the big sticking point between the punk and the metal scene. You know, and you know, with crossover and metal bands, thrash metal bands coming up with much more politically aware sort of social political lyrics and stuff like that, it became a lot more palatable for a punk audience, and hence the sort of late 80s punk scene in the UK got very metallic. You know, you had bands like sort of Concrete Socks and Sacrilege and English Dogs, and you know, you had punk bands like Onslaught turning into full-blown thrash metal bands.
Yeah, and the same thing was kind of happening in America too. It was like you know, both sides.
The rub between, at least me growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, between the punk and metal scene. The music had the same intensity, but metal was more frivolous in what it was using its platform to talk about, you know. Yeah. So,
but then you get like the Napalm Deaths and the thrash stuff,
and all the Metallicas and all this
started to kind of like get a little more serious, which I think kind of helped preserve metal and give it a second life. You know, it couldn't just keep doing Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy lyrics and
well,
stuff
then as
like
soon
that.
as they incorporate all this, you know, grindcore happens.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Yeah. Do you see any associations with, we're about to get to the heavier spectrum of things, but where does sort of the, grindcore, which kind of came out of the UK, a little bit in America too, it had some influence, but do you see some direct kind of pathways from anarcho-punk directly into the kind of UK grind scene and some of that stuff?
Yeah, I guess it's there in Napalm Death. Napalm Death were playing sort of punk gigs in the back rooms of pubs. And then, Mickey Harris joined on drums, and he started, that whole sort of blast thing going. And I can remember everybody stood there scratching their heads, it caught on, Napalm Death were a support band to all these, I used to go to a really well-known venue in Birmingham called the Mermaid virtually every weekend. And Napalm Death were the sort of,
they were like a house band there.
And and I can remember one week they were a 3-piece sort of grinding away like early Amebix, and then the next they were doing this insane sort of 3-second songs, all this blasting, and it was so odd, it was funny, but eventually that as the support band, they were pulling the bigger crowds than the headline bands.
Sure. Yeah. Once John Peel signed on, it was like, okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, there were a lot of bands, playing at hyper speed back then, Napalm Death and Heresy, Intense Degree.
Yeah, Extreme Noise Terror. You kind of throw that in there.
Extreme Noise Terror, Ripcord.
Yeah.
It was a very, very fertile scene, and there was a lot of cross-pollination between the anarcho scene, the thrash metal scene, US hardcore, all sort of coalesced.
So
that sort of UK hardcore thing.
Absolutely. So before we talk about one of the big swingers in terms of a band that we know had a big influence directly on metal, which is Amebix, there's one band that you wanted to throw in, and I didn't know much about them, called Exit Stance, with an album called Crime Against Humanity, and the tune Ballykelly Disco, which we'll play in this next set after that last Conflict tune. Tell me, I didn't get much chance to sort of poke around on that band. Where do they kind of fit into all this, and what kind of stands out to you about them?
They were kind of like, they came through, not on the coattails of Conflict, but they certainly, I think, more to, Conflict released them, Conflict took them out on tour. They were very direct in their approach, like Conflict, not frightened to front troublemakers at gigs and and get involved in activism and stuff like that. Again, as a bassist, Ballykelly Disco hooked me in with the bass line, but they had these sort of pounding tribal beats, similar I guess to Amebix actually, that we're also going to talk about. But yeah, again, an overlooked band, and they're still going today. Well, I say still going. They had a long layoff and they've reformed. But still singing from the same hymn sheet. Still committed to that sort of alternative lifestyle. Still a great band.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, no, it was cool. Like, one of the reasons I've had so much fun doing an episode like this is just the new discoveries. All these bands that. The next, we're about to get into Amebix, and then after that, Icons of Filth. That was a band I never knew of before all this, and like, wow, what a pleasant surprise as a metalhead to find them, in addition to some of these other bands. But they really stood out to me, and I know we'll talk about them in a moment. But yeah, it's fun to find these kind of diamonds in the rough, or bands I probably never would have been pushed to ever discover on my own. Yeah. So Amebix, here we go. This is definitely a band, not only with a lot of Motorhead influence, but this is a band, they always got teased or asked about whether or not they were fans of Venom, and they would kind of continuously be like, no, we're not fans of Venom. But they almost kind of like toe that line between this anarcho-punk scene and like the beginnings of sort of, not just hardcore, but some of the extreme metal elements that will start to bubble to the surface throughout the second half of the 80s.
You can definitely see some like where Hellhammer maybe kind of jumped off like that same kind of that direction and the whole,
that Frost and Hellhammer and some of those bands were hearing some of this.
I think it's Venom's definitely. I don't know whether Venom was an accidental sort of thing just because of Rob's sort of vocal inflection, but definitely there's a big chunk of Killing Joke.
Yeah, they were huge. Joy Division, Killing Joke, Bauhaus, those kind of bands, absolutely. So
they started off as they were from the edge of Dartmoor in the southwest of England, and which probably accounts for the sort of dark, sort of pagan, sort of ritual feel to some of their stuff, like
down by Stonehenge. Yeah,
you can imagine them sort of rehearsing. I think they lived in a big old house, that was all dilapidated on the edge of the moors. Full on sort of Hound of the Baskervilles sort of atmosphere, and but they moved to Bristol, where Chaos UK and Disorder, and that scene was really taking off, and I think they took an awful lot of drugs as well, like dangerous amounts of drugs. So I think all of that fueled that sort of sound that they created, and again, I was lucky enough to see them, at the peak when they did the Arise record. They were only a 3-piece, and oh my God, they were so heavy and so powerful.
Well, I want to read you a quote from yourself of what you said about the Arise record, because I thought it was awesome. Do you see if you remember writing this? You said the debut Arise is like standing before the open door of a blast furnace and melting into white hot miasma of pagan savagery. And I thought that was awesome. That's such a great description of a band, So
I can remember standing in front of them and just being carried away. It was similar, in actual fact, it's similar to the Killing Joke live experience, actually, where it seems to transcend just being a band on stage, and it's almost like they're summoning something.
Yeah.
It might have been the drugs as well. I think I was straight edge for many years, but I don't think I was back then.
Yeah.
Well,
you mentioned too in the book, and this was kind of interesting, I wanted to ask you about it, that when they brought in, they met Martin Baker at a kind of a co-op, and he comes in as their drummer, and he sort of gets the band into atavism, and I didn't know much about that. It's some kind of occultist kind of stuff. Like, I tell me, do you know much about what that is?
No, I'm desperately trying to rack my brain to think what it was. I think it's isn't it the worship of objects in nature?
Is that what it is? Okay. You mentioned it in your book, but you didn't really go into a lot of detail in the book. So I was like, oh, that's maybe something I'll ask him about, but I don't know much about it.
I'll Google it up straight after this. And
Have you heard of that before, Mark? Atavism?
I've heard the term, but I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't know what it was, but I thought it was interesting because we've been talking. It's the first time that kind of aspect of that, paganistic kind of non-Christian kind of influence starts to really kind of come into any of these bands, which of course as a metalhead, it's pretty common, but
the dictionary definition is a tendency to revert to something ancient or ancestral.
Oh, okay. So that's pretty interesting. So that kind of adds like a different element to this band, right? Than almost any of the other bands of this scene, Well,
their artwork was Rob the Baron, who went on to be in Tau Cross and everything in recent years. He did all the artwork, and it was very, evocative of like battles, at sunset, and there was a dark brooding element to the band.
Yeah, and even like the song that we're gonna kind of kick off with, "No Gods, No Masters." In your book, I can't remember who you're interviewing here. But one of the members, I'm trying to find it in the book, but they said that the concept of that song was about the concept of gods, because I would never have described us as non-religious. We lived amongst conceptual gods, if you will, at the time. The gods of science, of religion, of sex, politics, all of it. These are all almost like Roman household gods. for me, we were talking about a God that was beyond religion, but it's a horrible thing to have to use that word because you immediately get confused with religion anyway. And he says the Gnostics had this belief that reflected directly in films like The Matrix, that they believed that, you know, they created this world was a creation of the, you know, so he goes on this whole like kind of weird philosophical religious kind of rant in your book that I was like, oh, this is really intriguing stuff, you know. They were putting something different into the mix of like anarcho punk, I feel like, with that influence.
Sure. I mean, Rob, who did that interview and gave me that quote.
Oh, that's from Rob. Okay, good. Yeah,
yeah, I'm sure that's from Rob Miller. He then moved to the Isle of Skye where he makes swords.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You can kind of see where he's coming from. So he's working a forge, you know, out in the Scottish Islands, making sort of, you know, swords. So I think, you can see, you know, when you know that, you can sort of see where they were coming from musically. But I think, you know, their first few records were quite primitive. You know, the first few EPs they did, Winter and
Who's the Enemy? Yeah.
And then they did a 12-inch, and it had a track that always caught my imagination called Battery Humans. You know, but then they did Arise, which came out on Alternative Tentacles, and I seem to recall Rob saying that Jello signed them off the back of the EPs and then was horrified at how metal they'd gone.
Yeah, they said when they played it for him, he didn't say a word. He just was very mute the whole time. So that's yeah. They also said one thing that I thought was cool as a metalhead, that they used to play Mob Rules at the gigs just to piss people in the audience off from Black Sabbath, just like in between their songs and stuff like that, or before they came on stage and stuff. So they obviously like were kind of had a foot in metal in some capacity, even if they, you know, were kind of coming out of this scene a little bit. So
yeah, for sure. And I remember seeing them in Bath, and there was a band. Oh, what's the band called? There was a band supporting them, I think, were called Rest in Pain.
Okay, all right, yeah.
The singer had a full back tattoo of the Celtic Frost EP, Emperor's Return. You know.
Oh yeah.
And the girls and that chained to him and stuff.
Yeah,
that was a full back tattoo. So I think, Celtic Frost was definitely exerting an influence, you know, on the punk scene. And, you know, when you listen to bands like Deviated Instinct and stuff like that, you know, you can hear the sort of Frost.
Sure. Element. Well, even the classic breakdown in Scum, you know, that's like all pure Celtic Frost, you know?
Yeah. And I think Amebix sort of predated that. You know, I don't think the Venom thing was intentional. I just think that was just, that, you know, all their influences coming together in a melting pot.
Yeah, I hear more Motorhead than anything, especially like when we get to Nobody's Driving a little bit later. Yeah. That's very Lemmy-esque, you know. And
I like that primitive kind of, I think the Venom and Amebix both kind of share is that just that primitivism, if that's a word, in the vocals. That's probably the connecting tissue.
Absolutely.
And I think there was also, you know, an affiliation with bike gangs.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know, and there were the like the New Age Travelers on the convoy buses as well. So that was crossing over into the anarcho punk scene. You know, there was so many sort of different cultures feeding that vein of music.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even when you get to like, I mean, Axeman, which will end this set, I mean, the lyrics of that is practically death metal. You know what I mean? It's just like about killing people and chopping people up and, you know, Fear the Axeman and, you know what I mean?
Isn't that about an XS? Isn't it meant to be about an XSAS guy that goes off the rails or something?
Is that what it is? Yeah, I don't know. You would probably know better than I would. So it was like a falling down type situation where somebody snapped and kind of went off, like Postal style, or?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely a line in there says, "Is he from the army or the SAS or something?"
Oh, okay, very interesting. Cool.
You know, and again, that was interesting for me because I live very near where the SAS are based in the UK.
Okay, all right. Well, let's get into it. We've got a final song from Conflict, the aforementioned Metal Mania, from one of my kind of favorite, I think, because it's so metallic, the Ungovernable Force. That's a fun record. And then we've got Exit Stance, Ballykelly Disco from The Crime Against Humanity. And then we got a trio of tunes from Amebix. From Who's the Enemy, we've got No Gods, No Masters. From No Sanctuary, we've got The Church is for Sinners. And then Axeman from Arise.
So do or stand for, you just like the music. If that's all that concerns you, fair enough. But don't ride along on the back of trains to play to a rush tearing, staring people. Forget it, we won't be fooled again. If a tune becomes so fucking important, if all that's talked about is notes, chords and bands, when a record becomes rebellion and we turn it into action, an excuse for doing nothing, you are under pressure.
Required to put to the test. The ripping of flesh and the pulping of blood.
That was Axeman, The Church is for Sinners, No Gods, No Masters. Then we had, those were from Amebix, and then we had Ballykelly Disco, a little palate cleanse in between from Exit Stance before we started everything off with Metal Mania from Conflict. So we're going to kind of start to bring things towards a conclusion with these last kind of set of bands here. We got one more from Amebix from Monolith, which is a kind of an interesting record. It's kind of their most metallic and almost heaviest, but sometimes the production's not great. But the songs are pretty cool, including Nobody's Driving, which is one of my favorites from the record, both from the thematic elements of like the lyrics and then just the kind of Lemmy, overt Motorhead worship that you hear here. Any thoughts on kind of like Amebix kind of, you know, as we kind of wrap up before we move on to Dirt and The Mob and Icons of Filth?
I mean, I guess I think they hit their sweet spot for me with Arise.
Yeah.
The next record, like you said, I think they incorporated some of their sort of, their deep-seated sort of rock influences come into the surface a little bit. I seem to remember that record did it come out on Heavy Metal Records?
I can't remember what label it came out on offhand. I know it's 2 years after Arise. So
yeah, I think it was run by a born-again Christian, actually.
Oh, shit. Interesting.
It always struck me as a bit of a strange pairing.
Yeah, do you think he knew what he was putting out at the time? I kind of doubt it, that he...
Yeah, probably not. And
yeah, it was Heavy Metal Records.
Oh, was it? Okay, yeah, good call.
Yeah, okay, so... but I mean, it was, live those songs just slotted right in with the set, that was on Arise.
Yep.
And I think I saw them a few times as they were on that next record and stuff, and they were still incredibly powerful live.
And they kind of, as we kind of wrap things up, I mean, they were always sort of plagued by sort of health stuff with Stig. He was having seizures on stage, almost like a Joy Division type scenario, except he didn't pass away. But
yeah.
And they think it was right. You talked about the copious amounts of drugs and things like that, where they were kind of happening. That was complicating with his epilepsy, and it seems like it wasn't like a really healthy band in general, even though they produced great music. Yeah,
I think the intensity of that music was probably born out of the sort of tension, and the danger. Their everyday lives. And I think Spider, the drummer, for the last few records, I think he got tinnitus. He went on to be in a band called Muck Spreader, and then he got tinnitus, I think, and he's had to stop playing.
Oh yeah.
but then Amebix reformed with an American drummer, Roy Mayorga, I think, from Nausea, and did a comeback sort of album, which was really good.
I don't think I've heard that.
Yeah, it's definitely worth
checking out. Okay.
Yeah. So they did an EP where they re-recorded some tracks off the first few 7-inches with Roy.
I wonder if that's maybe my edition of No Sanctuary. It's the No Sanctuary Plus EP. I wonder if that's got the re-recording songs on it.
Yeah, no, I think No Sanctuary is a 12-inch, and then if you've got the one with Plus EPs, I've got that CD where it's got the Winter and
Is that some of the newer stuff you're kind of talking about?
No, that's the original.
Oh, got it. That's just an EP. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, it's well worth checking out their sort of comeback record, but I don't think it was to be. And I think, I think Rob and Stig, they're brothers and they argue like brothers as well. And, perhaps they just can't really be in a band together for too long.
Yeah, that was the vibe I got from your book.
Yeah.
So now we get to two bands that I kind of think are maybe a little bit of a palate cleanse before we dive back into sort of this more metallic stuff with Icons of Filth, and that's Dirt and the Mob. And Dirt, female vocals, kind of, Gary, the guitarist, was really inspired by like Poison Girls and X-Ray Specs to want to have kind of a female vocalist. Then they end up getting a sort of female guitarist, I think, for a little while in the early years, named Mo. But they're kind of an interesting act. And then the Mob is kind of, I don't know a lot about them, but I can tell you that No Doves Fly Here is just an incredible song, So tell us a little bit about these two bands before we kind of dive back into the metallic madness of, Antisect and Icons.
I mean, what struck me about Dirt was Dino's vocals were so piercing, you couldn't really ignore them. I mean, the only their EP, I think, was called Object, Reject, Refuse, Abuse, or something like that.
Yeah, Object, Refuse, Reject, Abuse. Yep.
Yeah, I didn't think I had it quite right. But and again, it was just so noisy, so intense. It was just a perfect record. I think the only album they did was called Nevermind Dirty as the Bollocks or something like that. And was it a live record?
Yeah, that was a live record. Yep. Yeah. So, and a lot of people, I think you even said that they were a better live band in a lot of ways. And so that Nevermind Dirt, Here's the Bollocks is kind of a good, representation of some of the high points of that band. Yeah.
And I think, that, a lot of those bands, if you captured them at the peak of their live performances, it would knock spots off their studio output. But it was just, the technology and the budget of actually capturing that, and also the difficulties of capturing it without sort of smoothing off all the rough edges, really. I mean, Conflict did various live records, and it never really captured the live Conflict experience.
Yeah, and one thing I thought was interesting about Dirt too is like after they kind of obviously had a pretty short run, they kind of reformed in the 90s after seeing a Riot Girl act called Daisy Chainsaw, which I think was pretty cool, because I kind of grew up with like the Riot Girl stuff. A lot of the girls I hung out with in high school kind of turned me onto that scene, and so I actually heard some of those aspects in Dino's vocals. So I was like, oh, that makes sense that they would kind of find a new spark from that scene that arose in the 90s and stuff. So
and it's good that there's a cyclic quality to that, isn't there? That, they inspired that wave of bands, and then they were newly inspired by them as well. And I think they did really great in the States. I think they're very popular in the States. Dirt.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hadn't heard of them until you kind of suggested throwing the Hiroshima tune in, but I'm glad you did, because it was kind of a cool find. So
yeah, I love that. And then the Mob were totally different.
Yeah,
really. I mean, they were so much more somber, and sort of poignant. And
I mean, No Doves Fly Here has this sort of like lilting kind of Joy Division, Cure bass. Like it's just got just really, it's a really interesting song. I mean, Penny even said, he says, I think No Doves is one of the most beautiful singles in the whole punk era. You know what I mean? So it's just a really, I don't know, they were kind of inspired by like Bob Dylan, I think you said in your book. Like they were, you know, they loved the song Hurricane and different like protest kind of songs. And so they were kind of taking like a different set of influences. And I think a lot of these other bands were.
And I don't think they're particularly enamored with Penny's mix of No Doves. I think they think he overcooked it.
Gotcha.
Synths and all that kind of stuff. You know, I think my favorite Mob song is probably Witch Hunt.
Oh yeah, it's like a can tune almost. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's, to me, that captures the sort of this sort of smouldering intensity they had, which some of the other material, I mean, if you listen to their album Let the Tribe Increase, I mean, it's a fantastic album.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think, you know, they don't capture the ferocity of Witch Hunt. Again, I think that was just a moment in time, really. But great, you know, that's a great record, that Let the Tribe Increase. That's a fantastic full length.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, in that very, you know, mournful and sad sort of lyrics and music, it all hangs together perfectly. I think if you like Amiga Tribe and stuff, you'll really get off on that Mob album.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I love those two songs I've checked out, the Witch Hunt and No Doves. So definitely get into it. So, and now we arrive with Near You, up near Wales, right? Cardiff, with Icons of Filth.
Yeah. So they were, I think they started in 1980, I think. You know, they were one of the first bands, but they were called Atomic Filth to start with.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I've got in my notes.
And I think Stig, the singer, was good friends with Colin Conflict, and they were following Crass around. So you can kind of see the influences at work. And Icons of Filth played with Conflict an awful lot. You know, they were sort of touring partners, but they were, I don't know, there's something about the way, I think it's Daffy, the guitarist, you know, the way he frets his chords and stuff. It's kind of like Voivod in a way. They were sort of making up these discordant sort of, you know, notes and stuff, but Stig's lyrics are incredible. You know, I loved his lyrics.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Voivod, because I pointed out something to Mark when I first got here, because I was listening to this Icons of Filth in the car driving to his place, and I was like, Mark, do you hear like weird kind of black metal-ish tunings in some of these like Icons of Filth tunes? And I, you know,
yeah, it's almost like the picking. The
yeah, it sounded like Mayhem stuff, almost. Yeah. So like some of like the slow parts and the ringing and things like that. And so, you know, Voivod, again, Mayhem, those are these like weird anomalous like bands that like kind of are, you know, singular in a certain sense, you know. And so these guys kind of sounded singular for that whole scene, even compared to like Amebix and Anisect a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the Icons of Filth were so furious live. They were just, I mean, I saw them support Conflict, but they were always more intense than Conflict.
Yeah.
You know, they were just raw, really, you know, angry. You know, like I said, Stig was such an amazing frontman, but he was an incredible lyricist, and I think his lyrics are some of the best, you know, that came out of the anarcho punk scene. And it was, you know, it was an incredible loss when he sort of died. It was probably about around 2005 or something like that. I can't remember the exact sort of date, but they just played a gig in London and he came off stage, and I think he had a heart attack or something.
Oh yeah, I think.
But that was just before I was about to interview him for The Day the Country Died.
Oh, bummer, man.
I'd interviewed him for Terrorizer a few times.
Okay.
And had him lined up. And in the end, I went down and sat with the rest of the band and interviewed them, you know, quite a few months later after they kind of got their head around what happened. And it was a very, you know, poignant interview because of that. But yeah, one of my favourite lyricists and such an intense band.
Yeah, and I mean, am I crazy to hear the influence that they might have had on like some of that more extreme metal elements, like in the future, or is that just maybe an accident? You think?
I mean, they were ahead of their time for sure. You know, and you listen to a song like "Evil Speak" or something off that "Welcome to 1984" comp.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, you know, it's just out there.
I mean, even like "Fucked Up State" that the first song we'll play from them has like a crossover thrash kind of feel to it. Yeah. It's pretty wild. And one thing in terms of influence I did find is that I think it may came from your book, that Jerry from Poison Idea, which is a pretty awesome American hardcore band, said that it was basically Motorhead and Icons of Filth that like inspired them to start that band. You know, so
okay, interesting.
Yeah, pretty interesting.
If you want to check out some new music, the son of Stig, a guy called Calvin Sewell, fronts a band here in the UK called Grand Collapse.
Oh, okay. I'll write them down.
And you know, he's sort of taken the baton passed down, you know, by his father, and he's creating, you know, really confrontational, intelligent, hardcore punk. So that, you know, that's an interesting one to sort of branch out into.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it. We've got Nobody's Driving from Amebix's Monolith. Then we've got Hiroshima from Dirt from The Object, Refuse, Reject, Abuse. I think I did that in the right order. And then No Doves Fly Here from the No Doves Fly Here EP from The Mob. And then a pair of tunes to get us started with Icons of Filth, both from Onward Christian Soldiers. We've got Fucked Up State and Death is the Only Reason. Or Only Release, excuse me.
Doomsday machine. The sky is empty and is turning different shades of color. It never did before, and we never asked for more. My mind is empty and my body different shapes of torture. It never
pain, addicted to love, in a world of hate. A swirl they run, a tree is their own, losing for religion, a queen on the throne. Give us lies, they hide the truth. We never die, so we will find the proof. Time to down, to face the beast. The style of all, nothing but the price. We don't want the master's state. We don't want your will of hate. We don't want the lies of cons. We don't want a tag of love. We don't want dividing lines. We don't want set times. We don't want a dead worthless fate. We don't want you as you say. We don't want a coloured lies. We don't want your fucking lies. We don't want your politics. We don't want the politics. We don't want a nuclear power. We don't want doomsday hour. We don't want to live in fear. We don't want a looted air. We don't want the atomic risk. We don't have to live like this.
All right, that was Death is the Only Release and Fucked Up State from Icons of Filth. Then we had No Doves Fly Here from The Mob, Hiroshima from Dirt, and Nobody's Driving from Amebix. So we're going to, kind of play a couple more tunes from Icons of Filth, but we kind of, wrap them up in the last set. So the last band that we really, kind of saved till last, essentially, and one of the heavier bands that was kind of part of this scene is Antisect. Their ferocious intensity. Certainly, I think they had a massive influence on like a lot of the merging kind of grind bands. I think Napalm Death played their first show with them and Amebix and Subhumans and stuff. So, as we kind of wrap a lot of this up, where does Antisect kind of fit into the narrative of this, and kind of what type of influence do you think they had even beyond punk into the metal and extreme sort of stuff?
Well, I think their album In Darkness, There's No Choice. Mm-hmm. It is like a classic Anarcho punk release, and it had the black and white poster sleeve and just lyrics forever. Every song was about 60 lines, of lyrics, and clearly a statement. And I think back then they were a 5 or 6 piece with a couple of vocalists, and they morphed into something quite different. They sort of slimmed down to a 3-piece, and they went much more metallic. So they sort of ran with the metallic influences that were starting to come out on the sort of In Darkness album. Mm-hmm. And by the time they did the Out from the Void 7-inch, they were a full-blown sort of metallic punk band, which didn't seem out of sorts really back then, because they looked and sounded a lot like Amebix and those sort of bands. all part of that scene. But again, an incredibly powerful live band. You never heard a three-piece make so much noise. Well, you have, but
sure, yeah. But like in that era,
classic,
then, yeah,
they were a classic sort of three-piece sort of band. And they were big guys with enormous hair, and they were. I remember I was either told the story or read it somewhere in a fanzine, but they toured Italy, and they were put up in this little sort of cottage, for a day or two between gigs. And I think they terrified the locals, who all thought they were like some sort of like werewolf road warriors, and they were bringing them sort of baskets of food and leaving it at the door and running away before they entered the door and stuff. So
yeah, they kind of got into it a little bit with the Carbonari. I think in your book you were talking about, and I think that like image wise too, you kind of mentioned that this is where like the term sort of crust punk starts to come into play with like them and Amebix a little bit, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was sort of denims and leathers that were sort of so dirty. They'd gone shiny.
Yeah, dreads, some of that kind of aspect to their, And
I think the hair was sort of starting to dreadlock, not as a fashion statement, but just because that was the most convenient way to wear it if you lived in a squat, or something.
I mean, I got to imagine Carcass was sort of into these guys a bit, just in terms of the imagery too, in terms of how early Carcass sort of looked with the dreads and vegetarianism and just like the politics that were
definitely
sort of
came out of that scene for sure.
Yeah, for sure. They definitely did come out of that scene.
Like what the hell, the atomic or electro hippies.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's electro hippies,
or like crust stuff too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So they were a UK hardcore band that would almost certainly have played with Anti-Sect.
But then,
like that were made.
But then, like for such a just an intimidating band, like they hit the indie charts with In Darkness There's No Choice, and they just missed topping the Smiths on that chart. You know what I mean? Like that's insane to me. You know what I mean? Because this is not cautious music at all that we're going to hear from this album.
No. That like I said, these punk bands were selling a huge amount of records, and I think it was, the stars kind of aligned for the punk scene back then, and you had Sounds and NME and that sort of, these were big music papers that were selling hundreds of thousands of copies every week, and giving 5 out of 5 reviews to the Anti-Sect album and stuff like that,
Yeah. I think the other thing that's really fascinating about In Darkness is that they merged and joined all the tracks together on each side. And I think it was maybe in your book, but like John Peel was like pissed because he couldn't play any songs on his show because like there was no way for him to like separate the songs and things like that.
Yeah, very punk rock idea.
And I thought that was pretty cool. That was a cool
story. You got to play the whole side of an album on nothing.
Yeah.
It's like the bathroom break thing. So you could go for 3 minutes or 4 minutes.
Yeah, that's the you put on when you gotta to go run some errands or something. But I mean, NME, the famous journalist magazine, said that the album and the band sounds like an angry fighter jet crashing through an aircraft carrier. I thought that was a pretty interesting sort of thing that was kind of going on there. And I think Pete, the vocalist, let's see. Yeah, I have a quote that I said, vocalist Pete, he left after the UK tour, so that's when they became kind of a three-piece. And when they were playing live, because the vocalist had left, this quote you had in your book is that some of the guys in the band didn't know all the words to the song, so then they said, necessity is the mother of invention, and we replaced any words we couldn't remember with the names of the 1966 England World Cup squad. And I thought I was just getting a kick out of reading this chapter on Anti-Sect. I was like, these guys are, this is the Italy story, the John Peel getting pissed off, we can't remember the words to our own songs kind of stuff.
60 lines each.
It seemed almost like a positive Spinal Tap-ish type situation where, things were just kind of going awry for the band, Yeah,
it was, when you listen to some of the songs on In Darkness, it's almost like a stream of consciousness. It's, they really lay themselves out, and then they split and vanished, and I think Pete became a producer in a studio. But they did reform the band, a few years back, and they've since done an album. I think it's called The Rising of the Light or something.
Okay. I've seen that. That's the one that's on Spotify. They don't have any of this other stuff on Spotify, but they have that one.
And it's on Lee Dorian from Napalm Death's label.
Oh yeah, Rise Above. Yeah.
Oh, it's on Rise Above. Yep. Okay, there you go. Yeah. That makes sense.
So it's interesting that how these things go around, because obviously Lee was a huge anti-sect fan back in the day, and then he gets to put them out.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Like your idols. You get to kind of own
he did
up
the same
to
thing
them
with Angel Witch.
Oh yeah. He put out some new Angel Witch stuff. So and then kind of. It almost seems like this scene starts to dry up kind of around 85, 86, 87. One thing you talk about in your book was there was kind of police were starting to kind of crack down on squatters and communes and things like that. You mentioned an incident, which I didn't know much about, called the Battle of Beansfield. And a lot of the protest spirit just in England was kind of starting to kind of die out a little bit. Is there sort of a natural, is that this confluence of events that sort of brings this kind of anarcho stuff to kind of a halt, or is there something more that you kind of would put a spin on that?
I mean, I guess it was the rise of sort of the rave culture as well. And
okay.
Sort of drugs, definitely took the legs out from under the scene, I think. I mean, I didn't really see it as ending, because I was already wrapped up in the sort of next wave of UK hardcore, which we've already touched on, sort of Heresy, Napalm Death, Extreme Noise Terror, Electro Hippies, and all that sort of stuff.
Gotcha.
And it just felt like a continuation, so there was all the stuff that had gone before, and it was all wrapped up in these sort of new bands, and it's only when you sort of pick the bones out of it all sort of 30 years later or whatever, when you're trying to write a book about it, that you separate them out into these sort of modules or whatever. But it all just felt like one big continuation to me. I think, when you look back at it, there was, a heyday for sort of the anarcho-punk thing, the same way there was for the sort of UK 82 stuff. Mm-hmm. And then it just morphed into something else.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense with scenes. That kind of happened with...
Yeah, we can only in retrospect can we really...
I mean, thrash kind of melted into death metal. Early death metal kind of had thrash elements, and then finally, just so those things kind of happened. But if you were like a outsider looking in, you kind of see like this division of, that's when thrash kind of disappeared in 91 or 90, but yet here it is. It's still around, so...
I think usually what sounds the death knell for a scene is probably when there's more bands than audience, and and there's just so many sort of copycat bands saturating the scene that it just loses its excitement, and I think that happens, and then what you find is the people that weren't sincere vanish off to do something else, and the people that were into it are still there carrying on, and the seeds have already been sown for the next sort of wave to come crashing down, sort of thing. So and it's happened to all the sort of you talked about thrash, and I did a book on English thrash, and there was a sweet spot, when there were some great bands, some great records, being snapped up by labels, but then it gets too big, there's too many bands, all the labels want their token UK thrash band, and the scene just sort of eats itself. No,
it happened to thrash and here in America, hair metal, grunge, all those kind of scenes that I kind of lived through, that always happens.
As soon as they stop being a DIY movement, the time is
no doubt
limited.
So before we get out here, there was one last question I wanted to sort of throw to you. Is I don't know if it kind of came up, but was there an equivalent of this type of scene that an anarcho kind of scene like happening here in the States that you kind of see, or was it a lot more just kind of spread out in the U.S. and then nothing ever really coalesced quite like what we saw in England.
Well, I definitely, I would definitely have said that there was. I would have said, if to directly correlate it to the period that we're talking about, I would have probably said sort of Crucifix and MDC.
Okay.
They seem to be, sort of sonically and aesthetically very similar.
Sure.
In fact, DC released something on Crass, and I think Crucifix were released in the UK on Corpus Christi, if I remember.
Gotcha. And I know Anti-Simics in Sweden, they're kind of thrown into this a little bit too.
So I think, I've always said it Anti-Cimex. But,
Cimex, Simics, who knows?
So
I'm bad at Swedish pronunciation, so.
And there's, my current band have just been released on Cimex Records, which is the drummer of Anti-Cimex.
Okay, well, so you probably know how to say it better than we do then. Yeah. Cimex, all right, got it.
But so I think there was an anarcho scene over there, and there was a band called Apple from New York.
Okay. It just, I guess it maybe seems it wasn't as big here, obviously, as it was in England, and
I think the Dead Kennedys, whilst they weren't an anarcho punk band, I think everyone over here took a lot of inspiration from the Dead Kennedys. Yeah,
and certainly they had some of the same shared politics, I think, of Crass and some of those bands, for sure, even if they weren't marketing themselves the same kind of way, so.
Yeah, so I think, but, there seems to be anarcho punk bands from all around the world, so I certainly don't think it's just the UK. I think it was, sort of little sparks taking light around the world.
So I know we're not done, but I know you've got to go. We appreciate you calling in from England with the time difference. I know it's getting late over there. I guess before you go, just kind of two last things. One is promote anything, like let people know kind of how to get a hold of some of your, the books you've written and some of those kind of things. And then just kind of any final thoughts on kind of the lasting legacy that this scene has had kind of on, modern day punk or metal or anything that you kind of feel like you want to say before we kind of wrap things up.
Well, I guess my publisher would kill me if I didn't plug my new book. So I've just done a book called The Scene That Would Not Die, which looks at sort of the last 20 years since the millennium of UK punk. And there's 111 bands in it. It's the biggest book I've done so far. It's 650 pages.
Wow, awesome.
And the publishers also did a double CD. It's 2.5 hours, 60 bands from the book. And you can pick the CD and the book up like really cheap for the size of the thing. That's The Scene That Would Not Die.
And is there a website people can get that, or would you just recommend?
So the publishers are called Earth Island Books.
Okay. Try and put a link up.
Yeah, I jumped ship from Cherry Red after the last book. Cherry Red, they're a bit more of a retro sort of nostalgic kind of publishing house, and I think this new book was just a little bit too contemporary for them.
Sure.
And like I said, I play in a band which gives a huge nod to anarcho punk, to Neurosis as well, I guess, in a way, and Rudimentary Peni and all that sort of dark, weird sort of stuff. And we're called Zero Again.
Zero Again, okay.
Yeah, so I'll send you a few links. But we've done 2 EPs, and we're about to record a couple more EPs. And
gotcha.
That's kind of where.
Awesome. Well, Ian, we do really appreciate it. Thank you. Hopefully you had a good time kind of working down memory lane. And I know we were hoping that if this one went off with a plum, that down the road we do want to talk about the Burning Britain book. And then obviously we just finished a American 10-part thrash series that we did. And so, down the road, I think we want to kind of geographically maybe move around the world and hit Germany. And obviously with your book, it makes sense to, down the road hit the UK thrash series and stuff. So
that would be good. Yeah. Cause the UK thrash scene is like the great underdog story.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, the narrative I was always sold as a kid is, the UK had grindcore. They didn't really ever have a thrash scene that ever kind of took fruition. And I kind of, it wasn't until I discovered, Sabbath and, some of those kind of bands. I was like, oh, okay, there was something happening in the UK and Onslaught,
didn't see it quite
and
as
those
much.
kind of bands, so.
Yeah. So, I mean, I managed to round up about, I can't remember, 85 or 90, UK thrash bands for my butt. So there was a definite scene here, but it was very underground and it was really closely linked to the punk scene as well. So I think, it'd be an interesting one to talk about.
Yeah, damn, that's incredible. Awesome. So, well, we really do appreciate you, joining us, Ian. And so we're going to get into one of our last sets of music here as Ian says his goodbyes. So any last words, Ian, before we go and play this set of music and let you go?
Yeah, I mean, just thanks for having me. I mean, I love to talk about this stuff. I mean, people sometimes ask me, what's my favorite kind of punk music? What's my favorite book that I've written?
Mm-hmm.
I would say the Anarcho punk thing, because like we said earlier, it's, it shaped the way I think rather than just the way I listen. So it had a really profound influence on me. And, if there's people out there still feeling the same way about it, that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So, all right, well, we're going to hear from Icons of Filth, Now We're Getting Warmer, and Evil Speak. Then we're going to hear our first Antisect tunes from In Darkness There Is No Choice. We've got They, The Eternal Myth and Paradox, Heresy, and Yet They Still Ignore.
Something because it's allowed to be. Passing up statements of status quo. Passing up lets nothing grow. Everything to do your reign. Time's now still more over. Everyone watches time. You may think your love's an enigma. Well, in mine. Any little effort made. Conjugate days more time and moon. Another step towards sanity. Make more love, space for each other. Can't be such a bad thing. Otherwise we crumble and trouble.
because they buried way of life on you and I. And others in this world, itself belongs to all of us, or have my fucking heard. Support the cause of war and use it for morality and label it as law. While these people turn happiness into pain and use the sorry one to another social gain. Salvation and disease, and who are these people with their systems by for free? Who are these people feeling pressure, fear and hate, and use them as tools to keep all lovers in their place?
That was Yet They Still Ignore, Heresy, and They. The Eternal Myth and Paradox. From Antisex, In Darkness, There Is No Choice. And then we kickstarted off with a pair of Icons of Filth tunes. From Onward Christian Soldiers, we started with Now We're Getting Warmer. And then we heard Evil Speak from their record, from the Welcome to 1984 compilation, which I'm trying to remember if I knew anything about that compilation. I didn't really write much down. I think that was just kind of like, as Ian was talking about, one of those great kind of compilations that sort of came together. I'm not sure who put that out necessarily. But yeah, even in like a song that we heard kind of in the last sort of thing, I think it was the Death Is the Only Release. I don't think I pointed out which song had that kind of like proto black metal atmospheric opening. That was the song that had kind of the mayhem sort of flavor to it a little bit.
That actually came out, it was a Maximum Rock and Roll comp.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Oh, yep, I got that freaking written here. Yeah. So, and there's like, anyways, it's kind of evil, really interesting stuff in that, Evil Speak kind of tune. Some of the lyrics were like kind of reminiscent of just kind of stuff that you would have maybe heard more out of like bands like Suicidal Tendencies and stuff like that. Like, and there's even this part in that song I kind of forgot to point out. I don't know how well you know like early Suicidal stuff, but there's a song called
first record, but
okay, so maybe you remember Suicide's an Alternative, where he gets like sick of suicide, like so freaking fast, like, and in the anger too in it, and so the speed that they get in that song Evil Speak was just like this biting anger is pretty incredible. So but kind of we're wrapping up here with Anisect and a few things before Ian obviously had to go. We kept him. We appreciate Ian being here. He kind of stayed like a half hour longer than
48 minutes.
So good. Thank you on that, Ian. So hopefully,
real quick, that Maximum Rock and Roll, that Welcome to 84, also had Raw Power, the Italian. Since we're talking about Italy, the Italian hardcore punk band that I actually saw. They played Detroit.
Didn't they have, like, who did the covers? They used like comic book covers, didn't they? Like almost like.
I don't know if they did or not. I saw them. They played.
Almost
they
like
did a reunion show.
Stuff is what I kind of remember on there.
Okay, they did a reunion show in here in Detroit.
Oh, really? Okay.
35 years after they fucking put out a record, but
how was
they
that?
were always. It was great.
I have them on my countdown. I just don't know a lot about them. I don't own any of their stuff.
I don't know a ton, but yeah, I enjoyed the show immensely.
So one thing about like Anisect, as we kind of wrap up here, that we kind of talked about, how they sort of just oddly fit in terms of their image and all that kind of stuff. But this is a sort of quote from Ian's book where the band says, "We didn't really fit in anywhere properly as a band, although we had roots in the earlier generation of punk, coming as we did from the cultural backwater that was Daventry. We were never really part of the London scene. We'd find ourselves hitching to gigs up and down the country, regularly waking up in some pissy bus shelter or train station the morning after or the night before. We did meet a lot of absolutely fucking mental people along the way, though, some of whom would later show up at our own gigs. At the time, to be honest, we were probably more into Motorhead and stuff like than a lot of the newer punk bands that were out there. And I never really felt the second wave of punk was that inspiring. There were bands like Killing Joke, who, despite being to this day one of the most powerful live bands I've ever seen, were just so obviously fucking mad that although the music was awesome, it was kind of hard to truly relate to them. When Crass came along, it was kind of the other way around. We thought the politics were great, but that for the most part, the music was just a bit too tinny and shit sounding. So, and then they just kind of talk about their big break that we didn't really get into was they got on tour with Discharge on the Hear, See, Say Nothing tour. And I think that probably like kind of, lit them up a little bit.
I know Discharge kind of exploded everybody's minds for, if that's the first thing you heard. That's the first band that
takes you out on tour, part of that.
Well, even from a listener standpoint too,
that was Ian's
Discharge,
first thing.
Yeah, that was, and same with, I've interviewed Scott Carlson. Discharge was a huge.
Yeah,
it was just like he said it was like the soundtrack to the apocalypse. Like never heard anything quite so to the point and quite so urgent.
Sure. And if you want to know more about Discharge, Ian we didn't ignore them on purpose, but they're really kind of more part of his other book, the Battle for Britain book. So down the road, we'll talk about them, Exploited, GBH, and some of the bands that were kind of part of that sort of thing. But yeah, and then they actually put some of their first thing out. I think In Darkness There Is No Choice came out, we forgot to mention, on Spider Lake.
Yeah.
So again, kind of an interesting connection, which is the Flux Pink Indians kind of label and stuff. So, you know, it was, like I said, it was a very insular scene and very, you know, everybody kind of was interconnected with everyone else. And so...
and it didn't really last. Like most things in punk rock, it didn't last very long.
Mm-mm.
You know, bands maybe put out a couple EPs, maybe a couple records, if that, all within the span of like 3 to 5 years, and then they're gone.
Yeah, I mean, Crass, you know, starts in the late 70s, but most of these bands were talking kind of 81 to like 85.
Yep.
And then like more or less, I mean, you know, Conflict pushes like, I think Ungovernable was 86, you know, but it's like a relatively sort of short thing. And as he kind of talked about, it kind of melds into this next thing, which is the sort of grind, you know,
thrash,
that sort of thing that was kind of going on. So, but so this has been kind of a fun episode. Hopefully you enjoyed having Ian in here to sort of guide us through. I know that this is, you know, for those of you that are kind of more, you know, tried and true sort of metal people, I think you do turn to Requiem Metal Podcast because of how diverse we are and the kind of historical, kind of contextual stuff that we like to do. So hopefully you do appreciate that, even if maybe this wasn't always your cup of tea. And maybe you found a band or two that kind of, you're like, oh, you know what, I'm not a punk guy, but man, Icons of Filth, I can get into that.
Or just like context of how, you know, what grindcore came out of. And,
sure,
you know, even the most tangentially, this is a very like at back of the room view of Napalm Death's career.
yeah, they're kind of like at the end of this almost, right? They're like, if we had a next song after Antisect, it might be Napalm, you know what I mean, or Extreme Noise Terror or something like that, you know.
But Concrete Socks did get mentioned.
Yeah,
so that was always when I interviewed Bolt Thrower, that was I tried for years to find a Concrete Socks release, and
I bet you
they might have done a discography thing since. But
I mean, speaking of Bolt Thrower, you got to imagine some of these bands Bolt Thrower was really inspired.
That's all they were into. Yeah,
it was Amebix
UK
and
subs
Anisect
and shit like that. Yeah,
probably even Icons as well. I don't know, did you have, I know you were kind of absorbing this in the same way I was. Were there any bands that you kind of were unfamiliar with that sort of stood out to you in putting this together? Were you, or maybe a band that you knew a little bit about but was like reaffirmed for you? Or
well, I mean, Conflict was the one that I probably knew just from that Ungovernable Force.
Yeah.
I knew some Crass, but I kind of, the story I've told on other shows, I was going to mention to Ian, I forgot, was the, when I first bought Stations of the Crass, I couldn't figure out what speed to play it on. So I was just like, okay, put this aside. I didn't know how to digest it really. But that, Icons, and I didn't really know much about Anisect.
Yeah.
And I thought they were pretty interesting. But Amebix is kind of the one that I still probably have listened to the most.
Yeah, I think they're the easiest listen, you know, in terms of what the kind of stuff we generally are into. But
Subhumans.
Rudimentary, you know, I think putting that Neurosis show together and getting a couple tunes on there kind of really affirmed, and then picking up Death Church. I think I've listened to that quite a bit.
They seem like they're one of those bands, like everybody that heard them formed a band.
Yeah.
They're like super influential to people that
like a Velvet Underground, Joy Division kind of, you know, that sort of thing sort of happening and stuff. So, all right, well, we're going to kind of get out of here. We've got a tune that we're going to be playing from Antisect's second record called Out From the Void, and it was actually a single that was put out in 1986, 2 years later. And that's really where you find the band really embracing their metal side a lot more, as I think Ian kind of alluded to. And you definitely heard metal in that last sort of section of music, but Out From the Void itself is certainly the most metallic song you're going to hear from this band. So let us know what you thought. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook. You can follow us, Jason and Mark, on Twitter, Requiem Metal Podcast. Also on Instagram, you can kind of find us, same Requiem Metal Podcast. If you're interested in supporting all the endeavors that we are doing and getting access to special bonus episodes, we recorded a bonus episode last night, although that will be up before you hear this episode, I'm sure, because of just kind of the way we have things scheduled. And, you know, that episode, we had patrons kind of sending us in questions, and we were just trying to kind of riff off of those kind of questions. It was very loose, very open, and that's what a lot of our patron episodes are. And so if you want to get more content, you can support us there. Or if you just want to support art that you believe in, we're a commercial-free podcast, and it's kind of like the NPR pledge drive. You know, we're always going to say, hey, if it's something you believe in, then throw us throw us $5 a month, throw us $10 a month. I mean,
I'll say it's like NPR, but we're not subsidized by the government.
That's true. Yeah. We have no subsidies. We're subsidized by
you, by the listeners like you.
Exactly.
But yeah, if the podcast that we do just for patron only, that's at least if not more 3 hours a month extra of different content. So
yeah, and if you really are kind of have been a long time listener, or maybe you came to us through Neurosis, and we know that we did get a kind of flock of new people, and probably ironically some of the new people who came to us from Neurosis, this might be like something they're heavily into because of Neurosis's punk roots and hardcore roots and things like that. But we've got episodes that go back, quite a few years, and a lot of them are kind of lighthearted and fun. Some are a little bit more intense. Like we did 3 bonus Patreon episodes for the thrash series, Heathen, Devastation, and Flotsam and Jetsam. A lot of times we've done some where we watch some metal documentaries. We've done one where we just kind of riff on Metallica. You name it. We've sort of done a lot of different things. That's where often we'll talk about new music that we're listening to, or at least just things that we're kind of listening to, even if it's not new, that maybe we wouldn't do a whole episode on. But certainly, check us out there. You can go to our website, requiemmetal.com, and you can click on the Patreon link there. The other thing that's on requiemmetal.com for new listeners is our old episodes. Our first 160 episodes are up there, and I actually have Mark and I it's probably something we should figure out sooner than later, but I've cataloged everything with links into a Google Doc thing that it's easy, because we need to kind of create like a table of contents maybe, so people don't have to just arrow back, because we do have a search engine. So if you know what you're looking for, or you want to try looking for a band, you can look for it there. But hopefully pretty soon we'll have some kind of thing where you can just kind of be like, oh, okay, I didn't realize they did a Blind Guardian episode, and just kind of type that in and or click on the link and go right to there. Or you can go to patreon.com/Requiem Podcast, and you can sign up to be a Patreon there and just skip the link process. So, Mark, any final thoughts on any of this kind of stuff that kind of came to you, or things that we've kind of forgot to bring up with Ian that you wanted to kind of get in about any of these bands or this movement? Or
just kind of cements that how connected the whole, any of these like small little subgenres of more extreme music, I think is so interconnected, and the stories are super interesting to me. The minutia is the most interesting to me. That the older I get, the more I've listened to stuff. Yeah. And just when you thought you've heard all you need to know about, Napalm and John Peel, here's another little avenue where you can go down and discover all these new bands that kind of share some DNA.
Absolutely. So once again, thanks to Ian. Go check out his book. His band Zero again.
Yeah.
What's that?
The Day the Country Died.
Day the Country Died is what we read from, but he's got his book on UK thrash. He's got his book on Burning Britain, and then he's got his new book that's looking at kind of millennium punk in Britain. He said it, and I forgot. I wrote down his band name, and I wrote down it's Earth Island is the publishing company, but I completely forgot to write down. Zero Again's his band, but I forgot to write down the name of the new book that he's doing on the millennium punk stuff. It was in our previous set there. He mentioned it.
Well, there's the thing called Google.
Exactly. So, but yeah, you can get a hold of that stuff, because both those books so far I've read. I picked up the UK thrash book, but I haven't had a chance to read it because I'll probably wait till we're moving in that direction.
They're huge tomes, but they're great because you can read them by the band, categorized by band.
Yep. So it's more of like a encyclopedia,
and by region too, which is nice.
Yeah, which is really cool. So. All right, well, cool. So we've got Out From the Void from Anisect from the Out From the Void single from 1986 for Requiem Metal Podcast. I am Jason.
And I'm Mark.
Almost With it,